There's a question people don't ask anymore. Not because the answer is obvious, but because the question itself feels outdated. When did food stop being something we made and become something we bought? Not bought in the sense of ingredients, but bought in the sense of completion. Sealed, branded, ready. There was a moment when that shift happened and most of us weren't there to see it. We inherited the result. In 1950, the average American household spent about 2.5 hours per day preparing meals. By 2010, that number had fallen to just over 30 minutes. The difference wasn't laziness, it was replacement. What filled the gap wasn't free time or leisure, it was a new kind of food, engineered not in kitchens, but in laboratories and industrial plants. The transformation wasn't announced, it was gradual, polite, efficient. It simply became normal to eat things that didn't exist a century ago. And with that normalization came something we're still trying to name. The factories came first, not as villains in the story, but as solutions. Post-war America needed to feed more people faster. Soldiers returning home, suburban expansion, families that looked like the ones in advertisements, and those families needed dinner. The infrastructure that had supported wartime rations pivoted smoothly into peacetime convenience. Canned goods, frozen vegetables, boxed cake mix. These weren't seen as inferior, they were modern. They were progress. Margarine replaced butter in millions of homes not because it tasted better, but because it was cheaper, shelf-stable, and carried the endorsement of nutritionists who believed saturated fat was the enemy. It sat in refrigerators across the country, yellow and spreadable, made from vegetable oils that had been chemically altered to solidify. It was science serving the family. That's how it was sold. That's how it was accepted. By the 1960s, entire aisles of supermarkets were filled with products that required no preparation beyond heating. TV dares arrived in aluminum trays, divided into geometric compartments. Meat, starch, vegetable. The portions were small, the flavors muted, but the appeal wasn't culinary, it was convenience. It was the promise that a working mother could feed her children without spending hours at the stove. The trays went into the oven, the family gathered around the television. This was progress. Somewhere in that same decade, high-fructose corn syrup entered the supply chain. It wasn't listed on menus or discussed at dinner tables. It was simply cheaper than sugar, sweeter by volume, and easier to blend into soft drinks, ketchup, bread, yogurt, salad dressing. The taste of food began to change in ways people didn't consciously register. Things became sweeter, not indulgent sweet, but baseline sweet, the new normal. The animals changed too. Chickens that once took 16 weeks to reach market weight were bred to do it in 6. Cows were fed corn instead of grass, not because it was better for them, but because corn was subsidized, abundant, and fattening. Pigs were raised in buildings where they never saw sunlight, arranged in pens so tight they couldn't turn around. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake, it was efficiency. It was meeting demand, and demand was growing. The language changed with the food. Processed became a neutral term. Artificial flavors didn't raise alarms. Enriched sounded like improvement, even when it meant nutrients had been stripped out and a few synthetics added back in. Bread that lasted 2 weeks on the counter wasn't questioned, it was celebrated. Milk that stayed fresh for a month, cheese that didn't mold, these were victories over nature, over waste, over inconvenience. Children born in the 1970s and 80s grew up in homes where the pantry was full of boxes and the freezer stacked with plastic-wrapped bricks of dinner. They didn't know that tomatoes once tasted different in July than in January, because tomatoes were now available year-round, bred for durability and shipping, not flavor. They didn't know that chicken used to have a stronger taste, or that carrots were once darker, almost purple in some varieties. The food they ate was the only food they knew, and it was feeding them in ways no one had planned for. By the 1990s, obesity rates had doubled since 1980. Diabetes diagnoses were climbing. Heart disease remained the leading cause of death despite decades of low-fat dietary guidelines. And yet the food kept changing in the same direction. Bigger portions, sweeter drinks, fattier snacks engineered to be irresistible. Designed in labs where researchers studied the exact point at which people couldn't stop eating. The bliss point, they called it. The place where salt, sugar, and fat aligned to override satiety. It wasn't an accident, it was a feature. The grocery store became a landscape of bright packaging and health claims. Low-fat cookies with more sugar. Whole-grain cereals that were 60% corn syrup by weight. Natural flavors that were manufactured in New Jersey by chemists. The front of the package promised wellness. The ingredient list told a different story, but most people didn't read that far. Why would they? The food was approved, it was legal, it was everywhere. Fast food expanded from the highway into every neighborhood. McDonald's, Burger King, Taco Bell, chains that served the same food in Omaha as they did in Orlando. Consistency was the product. A chicken nugget in Ohio tasted identical to one in Arizona because it came from the same suppliers, the same slaughterhouses, the same factories that mixed meat with binders and breading and preservatives. Children celebrated birthdays there. Families ate there twice a week. It became part of the culture, not separate from it. The cooking skills that had been passed from generation to generation quietly faded. Grandmothers who once made bread stopped teaching their daughters, who didn't teach their daughters. The knowledge of how to turn flour, water, and yeast into something nourishing became arcane, old-fashioned, unnecessary. Why bake bread when you could buy a loaf for 99 cents? Why make stock when you could open a can? The logic was airtight, and with each shortcut taken, something else was lost. Dinner tables changed. Families stopped eating together as often. The ritual of the meal, the one moment in the day when everyone sat down in the same room, began to disappear. When they did gather, the food came from drive-thrus or microwaves. It was consumed quickly, without much conversation about where it came from or what it was made of. The questions didn't seem relevant anymore. Food was fuel. Fuel was cheap. That was the deal. The industrial system didn't announce itself as harmful. It announced itself as helpful. It saved time. It saved money. It fed more people than any system in history. And that was true. But it also changed what fed meant, because the bodies being fed began to show signs of something systemic. Not immediately, not obviously, but consistently. By 2010, the average American was consuming more than 30 teaspoons of added sugar per day, most of it hidden in foods that didn't even taste sweet: breads, sauces, soups. The liver, which wasn't designed to process that much fructose, began to store it as fat. Visceral fat, the kind that wraps around organs and triggers inflammation. The kind linked to metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, fatty liver disease. Conditions that didn't have names 100 years ago because they barely existed. The gut changed too. Microbiomes that had evolved over millennia to digest whole grains, fermented foods, fibrous vegetables, were now being fed emulsifiers, preservatives, synthetic dyes. The bacteria that thrived on real food began to die off. The ones that fed on processed ingredients multiplied. The balance shifted, and with it, immune function, mood regulation, even cognitive clarity. The gut, it turned out, was connected to everything, and it had been reshaped by what we were feeding it. Children who grew up eating this way developed different palates. They preferred the flavors they'd been raised on: sweet, salty, soft. Bitter greens tasted wrong. Plain water seemed boring compared to juice or soda. Their taste buds had been trained by the food industry, wired to crave the things that were most profitable to produce. And when they became adults, they fed the same foods to their own children, not out of ignorance, but out of inheritance. This was what food was. The farms changed in parallel. Small farms that grew diverse crops were replaced by massive operations that grew one thing: corn, soy, wheat, monoculture. The soil was depleted, so synthetic fertilizers were added. Pests evolved, so stronger pesticides were sprayed. The system required more chemicals each year just to maintain the same yield. And those chemicals ended up in the food, in the water, in the bodies of the people who lived nearby. The distance between the farm and the table grew so vast that no one could see the whole picture anymore. Somewhere in all of this, the meaning of a meal was lost. It stopped being about nourishment or gathering or culture. It became transactional, fast, cheap, easy. And the cost of that shift didn't appear on any receipt. It appeared decades later, in doctors' offices and hospital beds, in children who developed metabolic disorders before puberty, in adults who were sicker, heavier, and more medicated than any generation before them, despite having access to more food than anyone in history. The system worked exactly as it was designed to. It produced more food, faster and cheaper than ever before. It fed billions. But what it fed them was optimized for profit and shelf life, not for health. And the consequences of that optimization unfolded slowly, invisibly, across entire populations. By the time people began to notice, the damage was already generational. There's no villain in this story, just a series of decisions that made sense at the time. Factories that wanted to grow, shareholders that wanted returns, families that wanted convenience, scientists who thought they understood nutrition, regulators who approved chemicals one at a time without seeing the cumulative load. Everyone was doing their job, and together they built a food system that changed what it meant to eat. The question isn't whether we can go back. We can't. Too much has changed. Too much infrastructure, too much investment, too many people dependent on the system as it exists. But the question that remains is quieter, more personal. What happens to a body, a culture, a generation, when the food it's built from is no longer food in the way it once was? This is only one thread. There are others woven into the same fabric, pulling in the same direction, and they're still unraveling.